All right. Hi, everyone. Today we're with Professor Boldrin. He's an expert in economy and has also been a little bit active in politics. We're here to talk about we're here to talk about his book Against Intellectual Monopoly. And as our first question, I would like to ask Professor Boldrin, what are his three main arguments against intellectual monopoly? It's for our guests who haven't read the book.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Yes, I had a little passage in what you would call passive politics, which is the one of those that wants to be elected. I didn't want to be elected, but I pushed and worked and cooperated with people that didn't work well for, I think, notorious reason, at least for those that are in Italy, but it ended back in 2014, and it hadn't started much earlier. I do politics like everyone does, by thinking, acting, debating, and proposing. And this is one way of doing politics. So the work, so in case people haven't read, I don't know how many copies are still around, because La Terza clearly didn't trust much the sellability of the book. So there is an Italian translation of the book that Madame mentioned that came out for Cambridge University Press in 2008. The La Terza edition, I think it's 2011 or 12, and it's this. You might probably find it. But those that are truly curious and don't want to spend the money, we have coherently with our position, which thinks that intellectual property protection is not that good from a social point of view. The full PDF text in English of the book is available from the sites. I pulled mine down a while ago because it was not useful anymore. Otherwise, I have too many sites. But David, my co-author, David Levine, has kept keeps his website running, and there is a full version in PDF of the book over there in English. Okay. By the way, David is also very near you. He's at Florence, at the Istituto Universitario Europeo. Yeah, we used to be colleagues here, but then, as you said, cherchez la femme, and he cherched the femme and found it in Florence. And so he's there since a few years ago. Okay, said that on the biographical and information side, what are the three claims? Well, the three claims are the following. First, as a matter of fact, as a matter of historical fact, I'll be happy to debate that, there is absolutely no evidence that what's called intellectual property protection, in particular patents, brevetti, and copyright, which is not the droit d'auteur. Copyright is the fact that you can't reproduce a book by saying that it is of the author. Many people in Italy especially confuses violation of copyright with plagiarism. Plagiarism being extremely common in Italy, especially among active politicians, professional politicians, well, from Mr. Boccia to Madame Madia to Professor Zamagni to many other. They have been caught plagiarizing to a level that over here would have canceled them from public life forever. But no, the stay no copyright, because I repeat this because many people get confused. It has nothing to do with saying that you wrote King Lear. It has to do with the fact that you take the text of King Lear by William Shakespeare and you publish it in whatever format you're able to publish it, and you try to sell it. Okay, so you buy a text, you do your work of composing the published version, and then you try to sell. That's the copyright. It's not. So let's not get confused. Otherwise, it would be very dramatic. And the other, obviously, is about brevetti or patent. So again, there is no historical evidence. Since the early days of the great first patents, in particular the patent on steam engine by Boulton and Watt in the United Kingdom of the second half of the 18th century, that shows that patents actually make innovation faster, creates an abundance of innovation, stimulates economic growth, and so on and so forth. That's the first fact that has come to these days in the economic environment, the applied economic environment, is known as the patent puzzle. Why is that the patent puzzle? Because, as you may or may not know, there was a remarkable shift in the attitude toward patents in the middle of the 80s. This is one of the worst mistake of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was convinced that the patent and patent protection would help, and led a very wide reform both of the antitrust attitude toward patent and of the judicial system of the United States that adjudicate patent controversies, and turn both of them in a much more favorable to patent direction. And in fact, this started a season of extension of patent protection to very many sectors that before did not have it, like the software, for example. Eventually, patents started to be used in the software industry in the early 90s that had not been used before, and so on, in the agricultural sector, and so on and so forth. And the patent puzzle has to do that in spite of this much stronger patent protection, there has been no increase in innovation activity, no increase in what we call total factor productivity, no evidence of that. And in fact, where there has been a big surge in innovation, it has been in the absence of patents. So that's the main message, and there is a lot of work on that. The second message is, this is not particularly surprising. There is a tradition in economic research that has been saying so from the beginning, and has insisted on the fact that the root of innovation is, for good or for bad, the competitive attitude of entrepreneurs and inventors in general. And it is, in some sense, the hunger for profits or the desire to survive that pushes people to innovate. That when they become monopolies, then they try to spend time in keeping the monopoly, and they use less time, less effort, less of their intelligence to create new innovation. So this part is theoretical, because in economics, there is a widespread view. The dominant view is that patents are actually useful for growth. The idea is very simple. If you want, I'll discuss later why it's illogical. Well, without patents, there would be no monopoly profits. And if there are no monopoly profits, then nobody sits down and spend all the money and all the effort that it takes to innovate, to create something new. And expecting no monopoly, nobody would innovate, okay? We also, David and I, got educated to this, but at a certain point in the middle 80s, a particularly, I think, damaging form of theory of growth came up, according to which growth is all due to increasing returns and, in fact, innovation driven by patents. And we never could make sense of it. And the argument that many pushed forward, including our friends, and a teacher of mine who won the Nobel Prize for this nonsense a few years ago, Paul Romer, we're still friends, but I keep believing that it's nonsense. And I tell him, argued that we had to use that kind of theory because what is called, now I'm going a bit technical, so this will appreciate only to economists, just to give a background. It's just words, no mathematics. It's a mathematical problem in some sense, that in the class of models that we consider appropriate for describing the way in which competition works, in which competitive markets work, it's impossible to have growth. It's impossible to have innovation. That's a fallacy. And we just pointed out at a certain point in the late 90s that there existed a traditional model, go back to Marshall, was a kind of column of modern contemporary economics, in fact, showing the opposite, showing that under competition, growth and innovation they take place, produced a number of models in that sense, and then realized that our theoretical work had obvious implication. Well, given that there is a fact that says historically patents haven't helped, there is a piece of theory that says, look, here is the way innovation may happen under competition, then there is a conclusion. Well, maybe patents are damaging. Maybe they're not just neutral. Maybe they're not just, okay, fine, they're good for nothing, but, they don't hurt, so why bother? Then there is the third part of the book, which is, well, what should we do? Policy. And there we argue a few things. I may want to get to there later of approaches to that. One of them is not what's become suddenly fashionable these days. So I find myself in a very awkward position after having insisted for a quarter century that we should work toward reduction of copyright terms and progressive elimination of patents, I find myself saying, President Biden, that's pure propaganda. Right now, it's not lifting patents on vaccines that de facto are very little protected by patents per se, and there's already large competition with 10 vaccines on the ground and more coming. So it's not by taking away patents suddenly and only on them that we're going to multiply production and supply of vaccines. Is by doing something else, which if you want we can discuss, but it will take us outside the debate, that you can increase supply. And so, stop the propaganda and work on the supply. For those of you that are interested, David and I, in fact, just published a fairly long article on this, trying to document the point. So anyhow, these are the three main take from the book.
Okay, I will go next. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for having us, Professor Boldrin. So let's talk about costs and benefits, right? A bit, because in the past 20 years, we have seen an increase in patent applications, right? In absolute terms, but also in intensity terms per million of R&D spent, and also litigation cases. So this has put a huge burden on patent offices. There is constantly a backlog. So we can see the cost, administrative at least. But what about other forms of cost for society, if you can elaborate more on that? And then what measures do we have to see benefits? Because we don't have any variables to measure the benefits, apparently.
Very good. Yeah, that's very, very good. So first of all, there are these very visible costs, which are in fact incredibly visible in big pharma, for example, just to stay on the actuality. If you look at big pharma, you realize that big pharma per se doesn't spend that much in research and development, spends more in legal costs that are 98% driven by what? By protecting the patents, enforcing the patents, making sure people don't come after your patent, designing the patents appropriately so that they cannot be touched upon, make them as extensive as possible, so that, if you invent Viagra, then people have to become crazy to patent around and find Cialis, because there is no room. If you work on cholesterol, then, come to dominate every potential molecules and so on. So, correct. And marketing. You see, there is one observation that economists know, but most people. Have you ever seen in competitive sector, in sectors that are truly competitive, there is no advertising, very little. Producers don't advertise. They advertise very little. When there is monopoly protection, oligopoly, then people advertise a lot. Yes, because you don't advertise milk personally. You don't advertise bread personally. You don't advertise your shoes personally unless you're upscale and you have some form of market power. So, see Gucci advertising, but your average shoe producer doesn't. So advertising becomes relevant when you have a niche and you have a specific market and you have an identity. When you're producing under condition of competition, advertisement does not become crucial, because you can't advertise a product that other can make similar to you, because you're spending your private money to advertise other people's product. So when you see the advertisement for, say, cheese, Grana Padano, well, it's by the association of producer of Grana Padano. Very, very seldom somebody that is particularly good or think is good, he says, my Grana Padano is better than Christina's Grana Padano. But that's a very rare event. You don't see people advertising their milk. If not, you see the association of milk producers, the cooperative, whatever, the consortio, just to stay in Italy, right? And whereas you see a lot of advertisement of BMW versus Porsche or things like that. And in medicine, it's the same thing, right? Pharmaceutical advertise because there is a monopoly thing. Good. So that's one cost. But what's the main cost? Well, the main cost is the restriction of competition, the restriction of imitation. It's a social cost. It's not a personal cost. So it's harder to say, but it's bigger. The typical view is, well, if you take away my patent, I don't make all that money. If you take my copyright, you don't take away all them. I don't make all that money. Exactly. But can you tell me why my example was Madonna, but the singers of my generation, the generation before me, or the Rolling Stones, are no longer actual. So let me use somebody slightly more recent. Do you think that Mr. K West, that is apparently worth $1.2 billion, okay, all out of copyright, would have decided to carry out a criminal life and very dangerous and not become a singer if they told him that, well, you know what, due to the fact that Boldrin and Levine managed to abolish copyrights, during your career as a hip hop singer, you will make only 50 millions or 100 million and not 1.2 billions. And you will have to sing in public a lot more than you actually do. And he will say, no. I'd rather go criminal. I'd rather try to get killed. I'd rather push cocaine or whatever. Obviously not, right? And the darling Mick Jagger, in spite of having made substantial use, I wouldn't say abuse in his case. It seems to have improved him, or at least kept him dancing, of substances. I'm not sure that if you were told you're not going to make hundreds of millions, you're going to make just tens. But I say, I'm going to waste my life, and so on. So what's that point? That point is about opportunity cost. So if from an economic point of view, an efficient society, and this has a lot to do with income inequality, I believe strongly that intellectual property protection, patents and copyright are at the root, are the main, not the only, let's be careful, not the only, but are one of the three main determinants of the big increase in income inequality we have seen. If you look at the very top, in particular those that tend to outrage people, okay? If you, at the very top, say 1,000 or 2,000 rich people in the United States in terms of income and wealth, you'll find a good third of that has to do with copyrights and patents, including Mr. Zuckerberg, by the way, including Mr. Gates, including Mr. The Google guys, including, lots of that. Not including Bezos. Bezos is a different animal. Bezos might be not somebody that enthusiasts you with his cynicism, but he's certainly a genius of business. But that's another chapter in another book. Okay. Now, how do you measure? That's very interesting, Christina. We have argued often, and I think successfully, that the proper way to measure if there is innovative activity going on is to measure how labor productivity grows. Economists have taken this very bad habit, which is extremely distorting. We and others have written a few papers about that, but not enough, of measuring the successes of innovation by the number of patents. Well, that's self-confirming, all right? So what do? He says, we invested a lot in innovation. We patented. Yeah, you patented what? The habit these days in the sector in which you can is to patent pretty much anything. Notoriously, once patents were allowed in the software industry, Bill Gates, at the time he was still with Allen, he was still running Microsoft. That was about 30 years ago. Said, we have to reach a certain target. Microsoft has to patent an average of, I think, target was 1,200 patents a month, and they pretty much patent any piece of code and anything, any string that they could find. That doesn't imply that Microsoft became so innovative. In fact, in that period, those were the worst year of Microsoft. Those were the year in which Windows would not work, in which Google would take over and show them how to do things, in which Innovator came up. And Google didn't come up because of a patent. Their code, which was the real strike of genius, admittedly so, if, 30 years later, is still the best search engine by a huge amount. That's secret. Exactly like the Coca-Cola formula. Why? Because if you have a good innovation that is not easy to capture and imitate, you don't patent it, right? You keep it secret as long as you can. And, Coca-Cola being the best example. I'm a big Coca-Cola drinker, not advertising here. And, sorry, something happened. Okay, so that's one part. So how do you measure? You measure by labor productivity. One way of seeing that Italy is unfortunately not an innovative country is by looking sector by sector what happened to productivity in Italy. It doesn't grow. In fact, in some sense, it shrinks because to the extent that some inputs and some other things, because of technological innovation somewhere else, become more expensive, it turns out that your productivity actually shrinks because your productivity has to do with how much value you add to the inputs you use. per hour worked. And obviously, if the amount of value added is constant, but the price of the input goes up, then your net goes down. So that's, I think, the way to look at it. And this was something that George Stigler, a person that many considers a bad Chicago boy or pre-Chicago boy, was a Chicago man, right? George was very tall, extremely tall. You know, if you look online, you find beautiful picture of him and Milton Friedman. Milton was very little, next to each other walking, and they're really funny. One was almost 2 meters, the other was 150. So the two together made a strange couple. Stigler correctly pointed out, look, you measure this sector by sector, not in the aggregate, and you look at labor productivity. And he was at one of those pointing out, he has a paper, very old paper, published in the year I was born, 1956, in which he says, hey, when I look at US data, and these are the data of the 1950s, so very coarse, very few, you know, took a lot of work, and I look at the growth in labor productivity, it seems to be growing more in sectors where there is competition and no monopoly, no patent protection, than in those in which there is instead patent protection and monopoly. So even at that time, 70 years ago, this was quite clear to some researchers.
I was supposed to ask you a question about finance, but I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit more about the effects that intellectual property has on inequality or the distribution of wealth. Because it's like, I think, the biggest problem we have today. And I wonder if you could just explain a bit more about that, or talk a bit more about that.
The wealth inequality, you mean?
The effect that intellectual property has on wealth inequality, yeah.
Well, it's very simple. I mean, the empirical thing is, why do we think that Messi or Jordan, or as I mentioned, Kanye West, or your singer or your actor have to be multimillionaire? Right? What's their opportunity cost to doing that job? Well, it's very low, as I pointed out jokingly. Anybody would be happy to give up miserable jobs in exchange of being a star. That's one characteristic of all that world. You do something that is fun. Yes, it requires training, it requires strenuous exercise, it requires willpower, but every good professional has to exercise, has to work, has to exercise willpower. You don't become a good anything. You know, you don't become a good coiffeur if you don't put training in it. So in order to become a good forward or a good center, you also have to practice, as Karl Malone used to say. But it's also fun, and we know. We all do sport. We all try to sing, try to act, try to dance, and try to play music because it's rewarding to your soul, to your spirit, to your brain. And if you probably make $1 million or $2 million a year instead of making 50, you probably still do it. All that comes from what? Comes from advertising, comes from restriction to videos, comes from restriction to the distribution, comes from copyright and the story. So that's very clear, and that's a huge part. But then there is a part that has to do with partly inventor, partly shareholders, farmers. The pharmaceutical industry is extremely profitable, and extremely profitable in a stable way. It's in fact a non-risky thing. Why? Because a lot of the risky research, which is the fundamental research, is financed by the public purse. Even in the United States, but I would say even more in the United States than in other places. People have fantasies about the United States. They don't understand that there is a lot of public spending here. If I have to say, it's better spent than in countries that talk a lot about public spending and then waste money in silly subsidies. So a lot of money is invested in this country by the government, by the federal government and states, but mostly by the federal government in financing research of any kind, basic research. What is the trick? That since the 80s, what you get out of NIH in particular, but also Department of Energy and other sources, NSF and so on, and National Endowment for the Arts, I mean, those are smaller. What you get in terms of invention, you can actually patent and make your private firm. This is true also in Europe. So, for example, you might have followed the AstraZeneca-Oxford controversy. If you look carefully into that, you will discover that there exists a private company called CX, like that, created by Hill and the other guy, I forgot the name, that are the leader of the Jenner Institute in Oxford University that work on vaccines. And this precedes the COVID thing. Jenner has been they work on vaccine to a large extent. And when a certain set of techniques to design and produce vaccines that were then used for the specific vaccine that then AstraZeneca joined to produce was discovered at Oxford University, these people, together with the Oxford University, created a private company and patented this stuff under the company for commercial purposes. And in fact, there's been a lot of controversies. Part of the reason that there's been a mess around that vaccine is that the people at Oxford unfortunately wanted to have their cake and eat it too, which in Italian is moglie ubriaca botte piena, or like my mother would have said, coming from farming things, as a musa e 60 franchi, which means kept the donkey and also get the money for the donkey. So those of you that come from around the Po may understand that. What is that they wanted? They wanted to make profits for the company. They wanted to make profit for the university, but they wanted also not to make monopoly profits. They wanted the pharmaceutical company producing it made no profits at all. Well, that's kind of complicated, and that's, I think, what eventually led to that crazy contract that they had and to AstraZeneca behavior. They said, fine, we get into the game, but I'm not going to do it for free. I have to find a way to make some profits, which is understandable. AstraZeneca shareholders has worked, it has got people to be responsible to. I'm sure you all saw this Italian entrepreneur that got the offer and got told from Oxford and said, I'm going to stay out. I can't afford that. I'm small. I need to make money. I need to have a return on my investment. If I don't have a return, how do I pay people? How do I keep up my business? And he gave in. So that sector generates a lot of sudden profits when a patent works. And that's, if you look at where it comes from. And then what is the rest? The rest has to do with reproducibility. Some of the great wealth of these last 30 years come from the fact that we can reproduce under monopoly. So think at a word, the word of electronic reproducibility is a word of winner takes all. There's no doubt. You see, if you're epsilon better than me, right, people will want to listen or use your stuff. So if Facebook is epsilon better than my face or my book, MySpace, whatever it was called, MySpace, I think, people will want to use Facebook. If Facebook is not imitable because it's completely protected by patents and it's largely reproducible, then Facebook is going to end up having 2 billion plus clients, and nobody else is going to be on the market because it's going to be impossible to imitate. Whereas Fiat imitated Ford, and that created Fiat and created something different from Ford. That's quite important. If you look at before we, off records, we were mentioning the miraculous decades of the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s in part in economics. And one of the things that was true there was a lot of development through imitation. Imitation and improvement. Imitation is never plain imitation. It always brings about some form of improvement, some change that stimulates further innovation and tend to redistribute wealth. This is not to say that absent patents of copyrights, there would be no income inequality or incredibly lower income inequality. This is to say that a part of it will not be there. Okay, there will be other, but so these are the main channels.
Okay, I will move to the last question, just to understand a bit better your view. So, is it a problem of the sectors involved, of the fact that components are involved, or final products? So there has been a change, right? Because a thing is to patent a final product, a thing is to patent a component that many would have to use, right? So
I'm not sure I understand what you were trying to tell me.
now I'm saying that patenting a component, let's say a general purpose technology, right, that many would use, is very rewarding, is a rent, right, for 20 years. It's very different from patenting a final product and not a component that many would use and copy for their purposes, right? And also, you said there has been an increase in sectors involved. We have even financial products that are patented, which probably seems absurd. So, is it the responsibility of this increase of the spectrum of sectors involved, or should we wouldn't have patents at all? Is this what you argue? Or, for example, I was arguing with Madan. Let's say I invent the letter A, right? And yeah, and it's easy to copy, but it took me 20 years to arrive there, and nobody arrived there. It's easy to copy, and in less than a year, my competitors copy it, better it, and maybe I even go out of market. But I invested 20 years. Shouldn't I be rewarded somehow for that?
All right. Well, you see, your example, so the answer to your argument requires a bit of time. Let's try to read. So first of all, your example is a good example, but it's a false example that never existed.
Okay.
I always invite people, okay, show me a piece of innovation that required a huge investment, but is easily imitable by everybody. You see, the example comes to my mind is Travel Pro. Travel Pro is the first company that decided that, yes, you can take a suitcase and you can put a handle on it and a pair of wheels, and you guess what? You can carry it, right? That didn't take a lot of innovation. That's easily imitable. So, in fact, Travel Pro didn't patent. Travel Pro is still the leading company in carry-ons, especially because it has the high quality. It was the first, and the crews around the world, especially in the United States, use it. Okay. Now think of this one of the vaccine at the opposite extreme. Behind the vaccine was a piece of cake. Took them 3 weeks. I mean, as fast as it gets, essentially the time to get the lab, say, all right, guys, here's the virus, work on it. All right, we got a product. Oh, let's test it a bit. Does it work? Refine this. Okay, done. I mean, you can't really get any faster than that. But behind, there was a big investment, which was the messenger RNA technology. That is complicated. So why do you think nobody is using Moderna open patents to produce more Moderna thing? Moderna released their patents from the beginning. Because in order to imitate and copy the messenger technology, you need to make a huge investment. You need the guys, the people, the women and the men that knows how to handle that, to do it. In fact, it's a very delicate procedure, so much so that various companies have thrown away tens of millions of doses. Silly journal argument, tens of millions of doses because something went wrong in the production procedure, because it's a delicate one. And it requires highly specialized work. So doesn't exist the expensive innovation that can easily be imitated at no cost. So I can imitate your automatic shift, if you come out with Tiptron and your Audi, if I am Porsche, but that's because I'm Porsche, which means I'm an epsilon away from you and I'm keeping up with your technology. And you innovate, and I innovate on another dimension, and I have investment in R&D that keeps me at your level so that I can catch up. But I don't think that if you're not BMW or Porsche or whatever, you can, if you're not at a level, you and I get in and says, oh, nice piece of car they have made up there. Why don't we do it together? We call Madan. He has some practice in the mechanics, we can start a little business. Doubt it. So that's the key point. Okay, that's the key point about around this thing, and it's quite visible. It's quite visible everywhere. Imitation doesn't. Let me tell you a story, but I don't know if this is go through. The argument that I said at the beginning, according to which, if you take away monopoly, I'm going to make the inventor that would have to spend a large amount to invent will not do it because he doesn't have profit is wrong. Assume I am such a guy and I'm here. I have to spend 100 million and I may have an invention or decide not to. Okay. And assume there are no patents. If I don't do anything, like the standard theory argues, I get nothing. You and Madan, Christina Madan, are the potential imitator, and you get nothing too. We both get zero. Now assume I spend 100 million and I create this thing, and then it's public, it's up there. All right? And you see it, and you say, oh, wow, that's easy to imitate. All we need is 1 million. 1/100 of what Michele spent. Shall we do it? Well, you think. If we do it, there's going to be 3 of us competing. And according to the theory, we're going to try to underprice each other until we sell these pills at what's called marginal cost. That is, at a price that covers only the cost of production. Okay, in that case, Michele will lose 100 million and you will lose 1 million. What if you don't come in? Well, if you don't come in, you lose nothing and you spend nothing and lose nothing, and I make monopoly profits. What do you think is going to be the outcome in this game? The outcome is, trivially, we call it subgame perfect equilibrium of this game. It's a fancy name, don't worry. Somebody got the Nobel Prize 30 years ago, Zilton and other, for figuring out this in an abstract setting. The implication of this is that if that argument of those that says is correct, then we should observe monopolists everywhere without patents. But that's not true, which means the argument is not only internally incoherent, because it leads to the opposite conclusion than they thought, but also uses some wrong assumption. What's the wrong assumption? The final one: capacity. That's something that with David we've been stressing a lot, and this vaccine thing shows. Capacity. When you come in, you, Christina, and you made your invention, we cannot imitate you overnight. Why? Because this is limited productive capacity on your part and on the part of Madan and I that try to imitate you. You will have a leading time that will allow you to make plentiful profits that we actually call competitive rents. Competitive because there is de facto competition taking place. We're trying to imitate you, but you have this advantage. It's like in Ricardo's theory of land. You have a better land than we have. When the Apple guys came up with smartphones, they were not the only ones trying it. And the other guys were, short behind them, closely behind them. Eventually they caught up. But they ever remain the profitable ones, the leading one. They can still sell at a markup. The markup has gone down over time. So the difference between the fancy iPhone and the other has shrunk over the last 15 years. Sure, that's exactly what the Boldrin-Levin model predicts. Eventually, you're going to go probably to zero, unless somebody comes up with an idea and creates the super smartphone. Then whoever comes up with a super smartphone, the one that also shaves your face and take care of your shampoo, besides cooking a couple of fried eggs, they'll get a premium. And then they'll get imitated. So it's very interesting there. And there was a big patent battles and so on, but patents were not enough, in fact, to protect. There was de facto imitation because a lot of components were out of patents and certain ideas could not be patented. And the imitation did what? It didn't certainly destroy Apple. If I didn't make Apple's fortune, okay? But it created a much wider market and quite rapidly brought about a remarkable improvement in that object. And a much wider world distribution. But Apple started first. There was limited capacity. It made a lot of profits out of it. And and this repeats. You look at I'm sure you remember the long lines. They're probably still there every time a new game box come out. It's the same thing. It's a signal of limited capacity, right? And so on.
So who arrives first anyway? It's better off. But it's fun.
That's the reward.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like when we run the 100 meters. Whoever gets there first wins.
Yeah.
But the others are not going that slow either. Right?
Yeah.
They're pretty good too.
And you can distinguish yourself without competitors anyway, right? You need them at some point. So your
Sure,
product.
okay, but I mean, a deeper. Now I'm running a bit out of time. I need to.
Yeah.
A couple of minutes. A deeper answer to your question, which was very interesting on the part that I avoided, has to do with this patenting the small components. Why? Because you see a lot of innovation, especially in the land you are, has to do with little details. That sometimes you patent, sometimes you don't, but it's incremental and it's hidden and it's small gains in the cost structure that you get. Okay. And that's very complicated. Now, one thing that we have a paper in the Proceeding of National Academy of Science, it's now 15 years old, showing that, and this was true, for example, for the biological engineering industry, in which they're trying all kind of solution to this problem, is that if a product requires hundreds of components, and each one of them is patented by one guy, then that program becomes very hard to produce, very costly, because you have to solve the monopoly pricing problem with 100 or 1,000 people. And there's been various, how can I say, reaction to that and solution that try to solve the problem of coordination while maintaining patents. I have to say that they were suboptimal. And clearly that's a world that would live much better without patents or with very short patents. And by the way, in final closure, I don't think patents should be abolished overnight. I think we should do with patents and copyright what we've done with trade restriction. Start out in the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, an international debate that's slowly and in a programmed way reduces the length of patent from 25 to 23 to 20, 18, 60. And copyrights, we can slash copyright of 30 years without much of a problem right now. There's absolutely no reason to keep copyright so long. It's just insane.
I think we can close with that. Thank you so much, and take care, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Very nice. It was a pleasure meeting you.
A pleasure for us too. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.